Welcome to the latest episode of the Edgar Rice Burroughs mini podcast. These short podcasts are meant to supplement the full-length episodes that I do with Jess Terrell and Scott Stewart, in which we generally talk about one of Burroughs' novels in detail. My name is Tim DeForest. I'm the author of several books about what I like to call pre-digital pop culture, things like pulp magazines and old-time radio. And I keep a blog about such things at comics, old-time radio, and other cool stuff. Right now, we're using the mini podcast to do a chapter by chapter analysis of the 1912 novel Tarzan of the Apes. Today, we're discussing chapter 20, titled Heredity. Now, please note that we will be including spoilers, both for this novel and occasionally for later novels in the series. And I would also recommend that you reread this chapter before listening to the podcast, as we will be assuming that you are familiar with the events being discussed. Now, the title of chapter 20, Heredity, is appropriate because Burroughs falls back on the idea of inherited moral standards to get the proper romantic vibe for Tarzan and Jane. We've discussed this when it came up in earlier chapters. Burroughs knew that he was using the idea that we can inherit certain behaviors and standards when he knew perfectly well that these things must be taught. For instance, when Tarzan gives her his locket and kisses it to show he realizes she was accepting the gift, the novel reads, quote, "It was a stately and gallant little compliment performed with the grace and dignity of utter unconsciousness of self. It was the hallmark of his aristocratic birth, the natural outcropping of many generations of fine breeding, and hereditary instinct of graciousness, which a lifetime of uncouth and savage training and environment could not eradicate." Unquote. Once again, Burroughs is deliberately using heredity as a justification for Tarzan avoiding certain actions. In chapter 9, it was refraining from eating human flesh. Here, it's to have Tarzan treat Jane with proper respect and not take advantage of her. He acts like a gentleman despite having no way of knowing how a gentleman should act. It isn't realistic, but it is justified. We see many examples of where Tarzan still needs moral growth because he has no real moral instruction as a child. But Burroughs realizes that there are lines that couldn't be crossed if we are still to consider Tarzan a hero, however flawed a hero he is at this point. So the chapter is pretty much a romantic interlude before we get back to the action. I first read Tarzan as a young teen. Had I read it a few years earlier, I no doubt would have impatiently skimmed this chapter to get past the mushy stuff and get back to the cool parts. As a grown-up, I do have to admit that the mushy parts are kind of sweet. It does, though, require Tarzan and Jane to fall in love without knowing anything about each other. It's essentially a love at first sight situation, which is something that rarely, if ever, works out in real life. But the story requires the two to fall in love, and without interrupting the adventure aspect of the story for too long, this is probably the best way to handle it. And as I said, Burroughs does invoke an ambiance of sweetness and tenderness in the character interactions. There are a few details I like, such as Tarzan's surprise that the locket snaps open to show the pictures inside. Burroughs has quite effectively shown us how intelligent and curious Tarzan can be, but there are bound to be things he doesn't figure out on his own. The snap on the locket is a nice touch that helps humanize the protagonist. And it's interesting that Tarzan doesn't think to try writing down what he wants to say to Jane, something he'll do in a later chapter with D'Arnaud. But once again, even the smart as a whip Tarzan can't be expected to think of everything. I also enjoy the bits of humor Burroughs gives us at the end of the chapter. Once again, if Esmeralda wasn't such a racial caricature, her panic in locking poor Philander outside would have been truly funny. And Philander's desperate attempt to play dead because he thought a lioness was stalking him is also worthy of a laugh. The chapter manages to end on a cliffhanger with Tarzan going off into the jungle to investigate the gunfire. It's an effective ending, since we know the armed search party is out there looking for Jane, and we know they might run into trouble either with the natives or with the apes. Now that's it for this time. Once again, my name is Tim DeForest. Please visit my blog at Comics, Old Time Radio, and other cool stuff. You can find a link to my Amazon.com author page there. Keep an ear out for future episodes of this podcast, including the full-length episodes we do from time to time. And thank you for listening. If you're enjoying these podcasts, we would appreciate it if you take a moment to leave a review on iTunes. Thank you.